have an article. There's an article on Gil Fronsdal's site, on Insight Meditation Center, that I had a long time ago in my notes. And I'm just reminded of his sort of more easeful or understandable, maybe, this continued discussion on, what is anatta. So I thought maybe I would just go over a few paragraphs from his paper, and then we'll see where we go from there. But it was a talk that he gave a long time ago, like in 2002, in which he talks about how people are often perplexed by the Buddhist teachings of anatta, or not self. And that one reason is because in different religions and schools of psychotherapy and philosophy, as well as everyday language, the word self is used in many ways. And when people talk about the self without defining their terms, then they might be unknowingly talking about different things. And so he puts out the idea that to understand the Buddha's teachings on not self, that we have to understand how the Buddha defined self, or in his language, it's atta. And so distinguishing between the two uses of the word atta, in some religious circles, it created, at the time of the Buddha, atta referred to a form of a metaphysical self. And a metaphysical definition of self is any theory of the real nature of the self. For example, the permanent self, abiding essence that survives death, or a true self that's larger or more essential than the personality or the individual. And so in this sense, the atta was translated into English as the self or the soul. And very distinct from the metaphysical use, atta was also commonly used as a reflective pronoun, like the English word self, as oneself or myself. And so in this latter sense, it was used in simple conversation and speech, rather than referring to a metaphysical or essential idea of the self. And so if we keep both of these uses of atta in mind in understanding the Buddhist teachings, on the one hand, he did not accept any metaphysical definition of self. And on the other hand, he emphasized the suffering that can come with clinging to anything as belonging to or defining myself. So the Buddha's path of practice leads to the ending of this clinging to that sense of self. And I think that the most common metaphysical self against which the Buddha was arguing is defined in his one of his suttas, the Discourse on Anatta. And for something to be atta, according to this view, it needed three components. It had to have complete control over the body, feelings, thoughts, impulses, intentions, consciousness, and perceptions. And it had to be permanent. And it had to be blissful. And so in this discourse, the Buddha makes it clear that nothing in our psychophysical experience has these three qualities, and is therefore, well, let me see what that sense is. In this discourse, the Buddha makes it clear that nothing in our psychophysical experience has these three qualities and is therefore fit to be regarded as atta, or self, because there's nothing that it has complete control over the body's feelings, thoughts, impulses, intentions, and there's nothing that's permanent, and there's nothing that's completely blissful. And so for us in the West, this Indian definition of the self doesn't have very much, if any, meaning. But we have our own notions of what the self is and what it needs to be, and this is sort of the legacy of the Western idea of soul. And in part, they derive from the strong human drive to identify with certain things as defining what the self is. We identify ourselves with our thoughts and our feelings and our consciousness and volition and personal characteristics, or even with our sense of continuity. And, held lightly, these identifications are useful. But held tightly, they are self-limiting. And if we expand the energy to cling to anything as the definition of the self, we sooner or later suffer. And that's what we can see in our practice, that in order to find deep, abiding peace, we learn to let go of any attachment to or habit of fixating on self-identity. So, contrary to popular conception, we don't really have a record of the Buddha ever saying there is no self. In the entire preserved volumes of the Buddha's discourses of the Pali Canon, in only one place did someone actually ask the Buddha, is there no self? And the Buddha refused to answer the question. And the same person asked, is there a self? And this also the Buddha declined to answer. He didn't like to answer these metaphysical questions. But what he did say repeatedly is that no particular aspect of our psychophysical being qualifies as Atta, or the self. Not our bodies, not our feelings, not our thoughts, not our dispositions, not our consciousness. The Buddha's teachings on self and not self get even more subtle and fascinating. Aside from the specific definition of self, he refuted this Anatta Laka Sutta. He argues that it's not useful to frame Buddhist practice through any conception of self. Views about the existence or not existence of the self, or identifying with the self, or any characteristics or experiences, even awareness itself, leads to a whole jumble of speculation. And more importantly, he claimed that they wouldn't lead to liberation. That's where we get back to understanding what it is, but sticking with the direct experience of the practice. As an alternative to framing the spiritual life around the self, the Buddhists suggest instead that we look at our experience through the framework of the Four Noble Truths, focusing honestly and directly on our suffering, the grasping that causes it, the peace or the happiness that results from the release of the grasping, and the way of living that supports a sense of well-being. And that helps us keep the practice more simple. The Buddha's teaching points us away from looking for the self and trying this to understand improving the self, and instead suggests that we pay attention to fear and desire and ambition and clinging, those things that motivate this building up of self-identity. So I just thought I would share a little bit of that for a little more reference to Anatta. If you go to Insight Meditation Center on their resources page, I believe it might be, Gil has this paper called Anatta and the Four Noble Truths. So that being said, it might open up, more can of worms about self or not self, or grasping, or, but it is interesting, many times you see it referred that when the Buddha was asked various metaphysical questions, he just fielded them, or he didn't answer them. So, as close as he gets to talking about the not self, or however it's been translated ever, since then, he goes back to, I teach suffering and the relief of suffering. So, however we conjure up ideas about things, the practice is where the simplicity of the practice is where we want to go back to. So, that's why I think that idea of sitting by the water hole where all the animals eventually come, that the practice becomes simple if we pay attention carefully and not reactively to our suffering. And, that for the sake of liberation, what we do and don't need to know comes to us if we just watch our suffering and its cessation, and watch our clinging, and watch how things change, and watch our aversion. So may we all know the peace of non-grasping, and of both the self and the no self. So I see your hand is up.